and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the CFO and CHRO South Africa webinar. We are here today to talk about how women in business can be true to themselves. There's only one women CFO of a JSE top 40 company, and women make up only 1/5 of the directors who serve on the boards of JSE listed companies. It's clear that there is a necessity for us to claim some of that space, and we would be forgiven for thinking that one of the ways that we should do this is to act more like men and be less true to ourselves as women. But we are here today to clarify that actually the case is very different from that. I have with me Candice Watson, the Group Human Capital Executive of AECI. Candice, I don't know if we're having, I think you are still in the room and you've just turned your camera off. So I do think you are still here. Can I get a yes?
Can you guys hear me? We just had a little bit of a technical glitch, but it's definitely a yes. I'm still here.
Yay! And then we've got Megan Pidigadu, the Group Finance Director of EOH, and Inga Walters, who's a leadership practitioner and co-creator of the Ignite Her Women's Development Program. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to your insights on this topic. I think that an interesting place to start is that we have in the room 4 successful women, and I'd just like to start with each of you. If you could tell me a story about a time in your careers where you faced a challenge where you've had to make a decision about using your own voice or being authentic. So Candice, I'd like to jump in with you, and then we'll do a little round robin to set the scene.
Good. Thanks, Georgia. And again, thanks to the participants for joining us on the webinar. I think this topic is so vital, especially at the onset of Women's Month in South Africa. Because if I think back and I reflect on the historical significance of why we're celebrating Women's Month, it's really about our matriarchs that's gone before us and that decided to use their voices for not only what's good, but for what's right. And I think oftentimes in the roles that I found myself in over a number of years, and especially sort of in a support type of function role in human capital, you're exposed to quite a number of scenarios, right? And whether it's inequality in remuneration through income differential reporting, or whether it's really just inequality in terms of succession planning and who gets the next big job and who gets the promotions in organizations. I've often grappled in my own experience around how do you remain authentic, but at the same time, from an organizational point of view, how do you merge that with the organizational interests? And I think what I've found is that you cannot speak up for anyone else if you're not able to speak up for yourself. If you haven't taken the time to understand who you are, what your unique skill set is and the contribution you bring into any role, whether a leadership role or a functional role, I think you're already behind the curve in terms of being able to speak up. But I think for me, it's at an early age, I was really clear and passionate about what it is that I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do with my career. And for me, human capital was not a default. So it's not because I couldn't get into engineering that I decided to do human capital. In fact, I did get in, but I decided to pursue my passion and not what my psychometric results said, right? So I think it starts with a really inherent sense of who you are. And if you understand who you are, you're able to craft that value proposition that you bring to a role. Because whether we accept it or not, sooner rather than later, people will see you for the true version of who you are. And more especially in times like COVID and times of business crisis and change, when people are put under pressure, the only version of who will come forth is your inherent and authentic self. So I think for me, to your question, what inspires me and looking back at my career, why do I believe in being an authentic leader? is that the only way to be competitive and to have a value proposition in today's world is to really get a good understanding of what is your inherent strengths, and then to play to those strengths, to embrace those strengths, and to develop them.
Okay, great. Inge, can we jump to you?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Candice, I couldn't agree with you more on your point around understanding your strengths and playing to those strengths. Early on in my career, I started out as a management consultant, and it was mostly a male-dominated environment. And I remember feeling or knowing that I was different, but not necessarily being able to put my finger on what I was good at and how I could use that to my advantage. And there were many things that initially I found hard. One of them was finding my voice quite physically. So even just really speaking up or speaking in meetings without having that belief of only speaking when you have something really important to say, because that clearly wasn't the modus operandi for everybody else, even though that was one of my inherent beliefs. And so for me, it was never really a question of whether I wanted to or should be authentic, because I agree that that's the only thing one can actually ever do sustainably. But I didn't know what that looked like. And so I needed to invest in understanding myself better. So self-awareness, starting with strengths, but also to look at some of those limiting beliefs, understanding and recognizing that in the workplace, there are external barriers that are more difficult for women to control. And there are also internal barriers. And one of those internal barriers for me was a limiting belief around when and how to speak and for what purpose. And when I was able to work on that together with strengths and potential triggers, knowing what I would do if I was put on the spot, I could live more into my authentic self. But it took a bit of work. And so that's one thing that I'm very clear on now, is to maintain on that journey in order to remain authentic. And so I feel one has no choice really, whether you are or not authentic, but you do need to put in the work.
Okay, great. And Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Georgie. So for myself, I qualified as a CA out of one of the big 4 firms, and then I don't know what possessed me, but I thought going into a mining company would be a good place to start my career. And after that, I went into an engineering company, both very male dominated. And I went in at a senior level from a finance perspective, and was one of the few women in those organizations, both those organizations. So, you know, you are trying to break down stereotypes of what women are, and you're in a very much male-dominated world. One of the examples was when I was at this mining company, we would go to the Rand Club quite often for lunch. And I'd walk into the Rand Club, and then I'd walk into the dining room, and all the men in the room would turn around and look at me. This was the early 2000s, because there weren't any other women in the room. And so sometimes you can have the imposter syndrome, or why am I here? And what's different about me? And I think I echo both what Candice and Inge say, is you have to be authentic to yourself. And at the end of the day, you need to show up through your work and what you can deliver, because often there is a question mark. Well, you know, can you deliver the same as men? And I think you can prove that through what you deliver and the quality you bring into an organization. But there are times when you do have to talk up and you have to defend yourself. So when I had joined this mining company, myself and another colleague, we had left from articles together going into the mining company, and we were both treated differently because he was a male, he was earning more, and he was put on different remuneration structures. And when I saw that, I actually went and confronted my manager and said, why is that the case? Because we were doing exactly the same work, we had exactly the same qualifications. So it is important, you know, to stand up for yourself, find your voice, believe in yourself, and talk out when you think things are unfair.
Okay, great. And I think that we'll explore all of these sort of high-level pointers that you've all brought to the table a little bit further into the discussion. Candice, you also can help with a little bit of context setting. Candice is currently completing a doctorate in business administration and conducting research into the representation of women in the workforce. So Candice, what do you think that are some of the factors that perpetuate the underrepresentation of women in the workforce currently? You're on mute.
That's the phrase of 2020, guys.
Yeah.
The phrase of 2020 is you're on mute. And I was sitting down and I was just taking notes as my panelists shared, because about 3 years ago, 2017, I was really plagued when I picked up the McKinsey Women Matter report. And I looked at the progression of women in Africa and how there was a steady but definite decline of female talent across the talent pipeline. So from junior, middle into senior management. And at the time of the report, only 5% of C-suite roles was held by women. And when I looked at that phenomenon and all the time I've spent in human capital, the question that kept plaguing me was, there's such a lot of really good, talented, experienced, ambitious, aspirational women out there. And why don't we have the benefit of those talents, the brains, the energy in our boardrooms? Because we find that our decision makers is not representative of the context in which we operate. And because they're not representative of the context in which we operate, there's nuances in their decision making that will always lack that diversity. Long story short, I decided instead of doing another self-help program on how to get the corner office and what I should wear and blah 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 to get to the top, I decided to enroll for a PhD through the Faculty of Commerce at the University of Cape Town, with my research being supervised by Professor Kurt April, and is quite well published in terms of diversity and inclusion literature. But we wanted to look at the cohort of African senior managers. So when I talk about African, by descent on the African continent, so South Africans, East Africans, West Africans, Central Africans. Because what we found in our research, for every output in Europe, for every 9 pieces of research that's being published in women in management, in Africa, there's probably only 1 or 2 studies that's being published. And the majority of that work is actually being done within a South African context. So what we were grappling with is, we live in a society where knowledge is being produced around why women are underrepresented in management, more specifically senior management, but our voices is not being surfaced in the research. Nobody's asking us, what are some of those factors that we are encountering? What are some of those exclusionary practices that specifically perpetuates the underrepresentation? And I think my research came from a perspective of an insider, as a woman executive, as a mom, as someone that's worked her way through as a minority group from an ethnic point of view through the management ranks. I've often been exposed and experienced some of these exclusionary practices, but something happens once you move through these ranks, where you have to develop a hardiness. You have to develop a sense of what my dad used to call a thick skin, a leatheriness around, I see the exclusionary practice, I personally feel it, but there's an angle of having to bounce back. And every time you bounce back, you're not just bouncing back for yourself, but also the women leaders that's probably on this call today that should be making their way through the management ranks. So what have we found? So I've been busy with this now 2018, 19, we're now final year of the study. And sadly, the boys' clubs are still very relevant. So the Rand Club, whether it's in Bryanston or whether it's in Zambia, because our cohort was across the board, it's still a very real phenomenon that socializing and social activities outside of the workplace that actually influences work-related decisions still happens. Women are still excluded because I choose not to play golf. It's not because I don't want to or I don't have the aptitude. It's a choice. I don't want to play golf, right? But it still happens. It still happens around the socializing in the pubs and the drinks after work. And I think what's been happening is, over time, we've made it almost normal and we shun away from it. Say, oh, it's just the old boys club. It's the blue-eyed boys. But what's happening within that social context, because women is not typically included in the boys club, and the boys club could be different things. It could be cycling, it could be golf, it could be the rugby tickets, it could be the cricket box that happens with some organizations, or it could be the cigar bars. Because we're not typically within those social circles, we are excluded from those decision makers, and we don't have the necessary exposure. So for me, that was one thing that was very relevant that's still coming out around the social dynamics that influences how business actually gets run and who makes decisions around businesses. The other clear insight that is coming out of our findings is the work-life integration of women. Women still want to choose. I want to make a choice. I want to be a mom. I want to be a partner. I want to participate in my children's upbringing. But every time you're not at the basketball match or at a PTA meeting because you have to work late or you have to travel, the first question men will typically ask on these business travels is, so who's taking care of the kids? And as much as it might come from a sense of care, it already puts you in a frame of, should you actually be here or should you be home taking care of your children? So the work-life integration came up as one of the key findings as well, where women are personally experiencing that internal stress of wanting to actually be part of a family unit whilst progressing their career. And I think for me, that's also been one of the key insights, because in an African context, we can't move away from our socialization, the role of women in society. And as I shared earlier on with an executive coach, I said, you know what, organizations is really just a microcosm of what's happening in society. So not to bore you too much, Georgie, there's still a host of other findings as we're going through the data. But for me, those were one of the two key things that stood out thus far.
Okay, great. And then Megan, I know that you've worked in a number of male-dominated industries, not just mining as a start. How have you tackled these boys' clubs that you must have found as you went along? How did you engage authentically while still tending to be on the outside?
So I think it is important that you show up as your authentic self. You don't try and be one of the boys, because then I think that lessens and debases who you are as a person, and you try and bring your whole self and your femininity to the table. And as I said earlier, if you deliver the goods, then eventually people will respect you for the work you deliver. So your work starts to speak for yourself. And I think it's just, about slowly influencing people and getting people to include you and to feel your worth, that you have something to contribute around the table and to the boardroom. So it's really about being very authentic to yourself and not trying to be anyone else.
Okay, great. And I mean, did you ever, how did you ever kind of navigate that social space? Did you ever get guys to come along with you on something, or did you find a way to fit in?
So I think I'm quite a curious person. So I always like to engage in conversation. And I think if you can find something mutually to discuss or talk about, you form a connection with people. And I think that's really what it's been about. It's not about going and seeing. If I don't play golf, I've tried, but it's not to my liking. And so I don't try and fit into those type of social dynamics that men would probably generally, be quite happy to be involved in. But it's more just about forming connections on a one-on-one basis with individuals, and slowly you get accepted as a result of that if you can interact and have a conversation and get to know each other on a personal level. So I think that's really what's worked for me.
Okay, great, thanks. Inge, can you tell us what you think it is that authentic women add to the organization? So what is the value that we add by being true to ourselves rather than trying to fit into some imagined mold of what a professional person should be?
So there are two things that come to mind for me, Georgie. And the first is that most of us have seen the research about the value of diversity on any leadership board or executive committee, really because of the enhanced decision making. It has been linked to greater performance. So there's a business case, therefore. And so that is one aspect that I think is important to acknowledge. The diversity, be it through race or culture or gender, always enhances a team's ability to address the challenges, especially the ones that are facing us now, that are just so uncertain and different to what we would experience in the past. So that is fairly firmly established. And when we are then our true authentic selves, we are able to contribute to that diverse group of leadership. But the other one is this role of culture in the organization. So one of the, some of the McKinsey research also speaks to the fact that the lever that is probably the most significant in terms of holding women back in the workplace is the organization's culture. And culture is quite simply how we do things. And so if women are not doing things in a way that's authentic to themselves, then that culture doesn't change. And for that culture to shift, when you are who you authentically are, and we see more of those women leaders coming across, we then start to see different kinds of leadership behaviors and acknowledge and recognize them differently from the traditional stereotypical form of leadership. And as we do that, we contribute to that shift in culture. One requires many levers in this challenge, in that you also need to be constantly looking at policies and procedures and leadership and commitment from senior leaders. But one element would clearly be to do things differently, to change how things are done in the organization. And you do that by showing your own true leadership style as a woman.
Okay, that's great, and I think that's heartening, the idea that we can really take ourselves out there, and that's what has the capacity to change things. I'm going to publish a poll now for the members of the audience to keep you guys busy as well. So I'd like to hear from you. Do you feel that you are able to be your authentic self in the workplace? Option 1 is no, I feel I have to adjust who I am in line with the requirements of those around me. 2, some of the time I can't be exactly who I am, but I do let my personality shine through occasionally. And 3, yes, I am confidently myself, whether at home, at work, or with friends. So it'll be great to hear back from you to kind of get a sense of how women feel that they are able to present themselves in the workplace. Candice, can you tell me some of the compromises that women make that can stand in the way of them being courageous leaders? And the mute.
Your signal's a little bit jumpy, so can you just repeat that question, because I couldn't hear you clearly?
Sure. So I asked, what are some of the compromises that women make that stand in the way of them being courageous leaders?
And I think it boils down to one word for me, and that's confidence. If you're not confident to own what it is you want and how you're going to get there, you end up compromising not only your values, but also your career ambitions. So oftentimes women are present, but are they actively engaged? So one of my participants actually in my research, she said, listen, make sure that your situation at home, your network at home, your social networks, people taking care of your children, etc., is stable and secure, so that when you are in the workplace, when you're busy working on your career, you are fully present. So what's happening is you're compromising not only your own contribution, you're not only compromising your own ambitions, because you're not fully present in your career, you're not fully present at home, and you've got this internal struggle of, should I be here, shouldn't I be here, am I an intruder, am I not an intruder? So I think for me, that confidence to actually own it and to acknowledge it, to say, I want to have a career, I want to have the top job, I want to be the head of this function or the best in whichever field I've chosen. That choice comes with a sacrifice. And the sacrifice in that choice is that, yes, you're not going to be at all the plays and at all the rugby matches of the kids and all these other things. And you need to be okay with that internally to progress, because otherwise what happens is you end up compromising your best talent and your availability at work. And at the same time, you end up compromising the quality of parent you are, because at the end of the day, if you keep suppressing your own career goals, you keep suppressing your own aspirations, because you've got the societal view of what does it mean to be a really great mom and an executive at the same time. Nobody's getting the true version and the best version of yourself. And one of the quotes that really stood out for me during our data gathering, one of the female executives said, you know what, Candace, the perception out in business is that men is always available. Now, we know nobody can always be available, right? But that's the perception that women constantly have to bat against. When succession decisions is made, when business decisions, when they look at the role of a man in society and the role of a woman in society, the perception is a man's always available. So I think individually as women, we need to be clear, what are some of those compromises that we're willing to make in terms of acknowledging what it is that we want to get out of our careers?
Okay, thank you. That's great. So it's not just about general authenticity; it's about being true to ourselves in the different avenues that we want to pursue as well. So thanks for that. Some food for thought. Megan, EOH, although technology is generally considered also to be a male-dominated industry, you say that you actually have a very nicely diverse team. So it would be great if you could just sort of put into perspective what you mean by diversity. How diverse are you? And could you also let me know how different it is functioning in a women-dominated space?
Sure. So I think all my previous jobs, I've generally had majority male teams, but coming to EOH, I've got 7 direct reports, of which 6 are women. And then within my direct team within the group head office, over 60% are women. So it's definitely different to what I've experienced before. And I think women, they bring a level of wanting to get things done. They leave the ego at the door, and they also bring a level of caring into the organization. And especially for the EOH journey that we've been on, it hasn't been an easy journey, and you need that caring in the organization to keep people going, and also that resilience to keep on going. And for me, it is really important that you bring diversity into the organization, but also inclusivity. You can have a very diverse organization, but no one feels connected. So you need to create that inclusive type of culture. And I do think we're at the point where companies need to start thinking, about the culture we want for organizations, and how do we draw on our collective diversity to be stronger as a result. And for me, it's really been a positive experience working with largely a group of ladies within EOH.
And do you find that aside from the kind of broader issues that you're dealing with socially, is it a more comforting or accommodating environment to work in as well?
So one of the things that we're trying to do within our culture, and then I think this also talks to Candace, I think work isn't anymore like an 8 to 5 type of thing and a 40-hour week. Work encompasses your whole life. And so it's how do you create a culture that also accommodates everyone? And people shouldn't be afraid to say, I want to go and watch my son play soccer or see my daughter's hockey match. You shouldn't have to be apologetic for that. So to create a culture where work fits in with your life, and that people don't feel guilty or feel like they're compromising. And that's the kind of culture that we've been trying to drive at EOH. And I think even now with COVID and lockdown, someone said, one of our board members said, is it a disruption or an interruption? And what COVID has caused, and will we ever go back to normal? And I think now is a time where we get to rewrite the script of what normal should look like and what work should look like, and how do we make sure that it fits into people's lives. So it's just creating that type of inclusive culture where people feel valued, and they also feel that they can go and do what they either need to do for their family or from a personal perspective as well.
Okay, great. Megan, your comments on both dealing with COVID and EOH's specific challenges at the moment lead into my next question for Inga, which is that you've told me that women have certain characteristics that actually are better suited to carrying an organization through a time of challenge or crisis. So could you just explain a little bit about that, about why we're the leaders the world needs right now?
We certainly have a head start. Georgie, when I joined the McKinsey Women team in 2011, they had done some research following the financial crisis to look at leadership behaviors that are required to navigate through a time of crisis. And there were a couple of leadership behaviors that were identified as ones that lead to organizational success. And of the 9 leadership behaviors, there were 3 of the top 4 are behaviors that are displayed more often by women on average. And these are participative decision-making, expectation and rewards, as well as inspiration. The other one that's actually top of the list is intellectual stimulation, and that one is applied equally by men and women. So what that says is that, especially in uncertain times, and we are certainly facing one crisis after another, believing that 2008 was our big one, was only really the first of many, but it does really give you the sense that it's very likely that those very leadership behaviors are still relevant and are more often displayed by women. And in more recent times, research also includes other aspects in terms of women often being more open to new perspectives, being more open to collaboration, and a new one also around fairness. Many women are actually more drawn to and more articulate about being fair in a business environment. And so, so those aspects, I think, are important to draw on in these times. And if you think more recently and specifically about the impact of now working from home, for so many women, in a way, not traveling as much as before enables there being more leveling of the playing field, because men aren't traveling either, and men are also on Zoom calls. And let's face it, we've dealt with our children coming into the room for many years or managing things in the background. So many women actually have much greater composure, because for the first time now, men are facing the same challenges of having that happening at home. So I'm optimistic to see how women can take this opportunity to draw on what would be naturally inherent strengths that are very helpful in times of crisis and uncertainty, and know that we've been doing this for a while, and we can continue to do this, and perhaps not try and hold back in a way that we feel we have to be a certain way.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to end the poll now. But just to run through it, fortunately, only 7% of women, although I still argue that that's too high, feel that they have to adjust who they are in line with the people around them, in line with the requirements of the people around them. The majority, but only by a small amount, 49% said that some of the time they can be who they are, but they can let their personalities shine through occasionally. And 44% said yes, they are confidently themselves, whether at home, at work, or with friends. So there's kind of quite a nice balance between being confidently yourself, and then feeling that at some of the time you can be confidently yourself. But Candice, so I'd like to hear from you. What are the risks? Are there any risks associated with being authentically yourself? Is there a challenge, or is there something that needs to be overcome if you're being true to yourself? Is the workplace ready for authentic women?
Yeah, and I think I shared this with you, Georgie, in one of our pre-calls. I think that the reality is being your authentic self is uncomfortable, because we live in a society where we want more of the same. We love cliques, we love clubs, we love groupthink, because guess what? If everybody around the room looks like me, thinks the way I do, it's easy to do business, because nobody has to switch their brains on, nobody has to participate, we have a voice, and off we go. And we understand that obviously at the foundations of society, you definitely need that social cohesion, and you need to have collaboration, etc. But when it comes to the workplace, and I shared it anecdotally with Georgie, is that nobody is waiting for you with open arms and say, oh, welcome, just be the truest version of who you are. Because we recruit people for job descriptions, and we recruit people for competency sets and for skills, etc. And when you come into the workplace, that's what we want to see, right? So I think there is a risk with showing up as your authentic self. And I don't want the audience to confuse your authentic self with values, because when it comes to my inherent values, those are non-negotiables, right? And I think we all need, especially if you think about value-based leadership and the theory around that, when we find ourselves in the world, when we find ourselves as South Africans during this pandemic, there's certain things that's non-negotiable in terms of values: honesty, integrity, teamwork. Those things are inherent to who you are and for societies to be successful. But in terms of being your authentic self, there will be a level of adaptation required in the organization. And because organizations is so systemic in terms of the culture, the way they set up, the risk of showing up as your authentic self is the risk of rejection. And I think rejection, whether in the workplace, in personal relationships, wherever you find yourself in life's journey, there's two lenses. It's the lens of I'm being rejected because I'm not good enough, therefore something's wrong with me and I have to adjust. Or there's the lens of I'm being rejected because maybe this is not the right moment. I will continue being myself, but I will learn how to adapt the version of who I am until I'm in a position to change the system. And someone said a while back at a conference I attended that sometimes we need to play within the rules of the game until we are part of the system to influence and change those games. And what's concerning me with women in business is that we don't have the tipping point of sufficient, experienced, competent voices of women in circles of change and driving those changes. Because we oftentimes opt out in the management pipeline, whether in middle management or just getting into senior management, because whether we want to accept it or not, nobody wants to deal with rejection. But rejection is so important because it develops that resilience and that bounce back and the perspective of, okay, I showed up as X. How do I adapt it next time without really losing my authentic self? But I can tell you, Georgie, there's no campaign of people standing outside, and saying, hey, everybody, just be yourself on Monday. Because people typically don't like change. People want more of the same. It makes them comfortable.
Okay, fantastic. Megan, one of the things that you mentioned is that you feel that women don't network as well or as efficiently as men. And I wondered if you had kind of 3 hot tips or an anecdote to share for how you feel you could address that.
Thanks, Georgie. I just want to add to what Candace also talks about before I answer that question. So one of my favorite authors is Brené Brown. And she talks about being vulnerable and, showing up and having to be brave and courageous. And I think that's a lot of what it takes to show up as your authentic self. So that's just as an aside and to add. But from my perspective, I think when you look at the way men aren't afraid to network, to call in their network and people they know. And so I think women can do better in terms of forming support groups, if you want to call it that. So I'm part of an amazing women's group. It's very kind of informal, but everyone supports each other. And one of my favorite sayings as well is we rise by lifting others. And I think that applies to women. So, where there's an opportunity that we can actually help and give a step up to other women, be it within the organization, outside of our organizations, we should be doing that. And where there's opportunity to mentor, help mentor younger talent. And then the other thing is when you're in meetings and there's the quiet voices in the room and the people who don't always speak out, try and see how you can include them and let them be heard. And let it not always be the loud voices and the people who want to be heard. Because sometimes those people who are quieter have really got some pearls of wisdom to impart and value to add. So again, I think it really talks to having an inclusive culture and making people feel part of what you're doing and supporting women in that way.
Okay, great, Megan. Thanks so much. Inga, we have you know, we're talking about kind of identifying your strengths and letting those shine through. How can women identify personally what their own strengths are? Because sometimes it can be, oh, well, maybe I'm really loud and outspoken, but that's not actually always the best thing to be in the boardroom. So how do you work out exactly what you should be putting out there?
There are many ways, and there are some wonderful profiling tools out there that can get you started on becoming more clear on what those are. I personally work with the Enneagram extensively, and because that also helps you to understand your motivation, that's one way of really getting to the essence of what drives you, what you are good at, what triggers you, what your blind spots are. And so there are so many alternatives, but if you need to start somewhere, I would say do some sort of an assessment, have a conversation about what that actually means for you in your work role. And where possible, go on programs. The Ignite Her program that Donna Rachelson and I have co-created speak to so many of the elements we've touched on. It speaks to confidence through owning your space. It speaks to context, working with your context, connection, so many things there that we can learn, and caring for self and others. And then you start somewhere by assessing where you are, working with those things, within a community of other women and with external support. So there are really options out there to engage with this, because what I've found more than anything is that if you're not intentional about it, it will happen to you and you'll get carried away in a current. But when you start thinking about these things and planning for them like you would in the business context, so as you would have a business plan for a new business, you can have a 2-year plan or business plan on a page for your career over the next year or two. And you can think more strategically about who you would want to have in your network and how to approach them. So if you don't do the work, it will pass you by. And that's why the intentionality is really the important part here. And then once you make that commitment, it's about finding the right level of support.
Okay, awesome. Everyone, I think that we've had a very valuable panel, and it's been really great to hear the insights from all of you. I'd like to go over to a couple of the audience questions now. The one I'd like to start with came from Amanda Kush Otieno, who said, how can we help other women come into these leadership positions so that we can have more representation and influence in decision making? And then she comments, as a pioneer woman in these positions, we must help more women to rise. So Candice, I don't know if you can jump in on that one.
Thanks, Amanda. That is such a relevant question. And I think for me, I have to go back to what Megan said around networking. We underestimate as women the importance of networking. And the reason I'm picking that up is because not only based on my personal experience, but also what I've seen coming out of the research, women think that their smarts and their hard work is going to speak for them, and it doesn't really happen like that. You need to put yourself out there socially to be part of the conversations, to share your insights, to share your experiences, to create the exposure. And one of the key ways that has happened for my participants, that's obviously the ladies that was part of my research, mostly senior management, C-suite executives, is through having active professional sponsors. And I'm sure Megan can back me up on this. Even in my own career, the impact of having a professional sponsor is absolutely key, because that is an individual that's already in the boys club. He already has credibility in the boys club. He already understands the business, the networks, and the industries. And those type of individuals will know about opportunities before you know about it, because you're not necessarily part of those discussions. And they will then give you opportunities to get onto projects, to get exposure, etc. So I think for me, how to get into the C-suite, definitely key sponsors, being able to identify key sponsors, and being able to deliver. Because when you are being sponsored, you can't just do your day job. You're going to do your day job and then some. Because it will be projects, it will be cross-functional exposure, it's going to be a lot of hard work. The second thing I think that's really important for women as they make their way to the top or how to get into these roles is to actively pursue mentorship. And I think as women, we love talking to each other about the best books that's out, about our hobbies, about what's happening in the kids' school, but we never take the time to engage on business-related topics. So identifying and actively pursuing mentorship and mentoring relationships is very key, because that will be your soundboard. That will be the individuals that will give you their own experience, their own insights in terms of how to navigate some of these very challenging practices which you will encounter. There's no staircase to the top. It's a lot of hard work, and you will have to build the resilience as you go. And I think, Georgie, finally, from my end, I think we, in a society today that, social media, social influence, followers, etc., is really fun, and I call them the keyboard ninjas, right? You can have the strongest views and opinions on social media, but you just have to work really hard. When I look at my cohort of participants again, most of them have postgraduate qualifications. I had a few scientists in my research, some people having their functional qualifications like CASA, and they'll have business degrees. Because I'm going to say something that's not really popular, but I'll say it anyway because it's Women's Month. Women sometimes have to be twice as qualified and 3 times as experienced to be considered half as good. And that is unfortunate because we don't have the mass, we don't have the critical mass, and this has been a systemic issue over time. Are we going to see gender scales rebalance in corporate SA or corporates globally? Probably not in the next 80 years, as my research head told me in Cape Town 2 years ago, when I said that according to the UN, it will take plus 80 years for us to get to gender equality. And his comment was, well, you're ambitious if you think it's going to happen in plus 80 years. But do we have the ability as women today to start making those small changes and doing what is maybe uncomfortable? But I find that as the more you push yourself out of your comfort zone, that's actually where the growth happens. So I think for me, that will be the 3 things: is identify a key sponsor, pursue active mentoring relationships, and finally, just be prepared to really do the hard work.
Okay, great. I see that we have a question specifically for Megan, which is from Zama Gwebu, asking, what systems or measures and metrics do you use to ensure and achieve a culture of inclusivity and work encompassing your whole life? And how do you track and trace this? Can you put a figure to it? From the beginning.
So maybe let me answer one thing in terms of like how I manage my career. So I'm also a mother of 2 and very engaged with my family as well. And I think it's important not to be apologetic about who you are, and also to set boundaries in terms of your life. Like, don't be afraid. So one of my examples, and I say this to my team all the time, is don't try and find me after 6 o'clock, because I'm with my family, and I'm not apologetic about that. But if you want to find me, I'll probably be back online at 8:30 in the evening. So, it's important to set your boundaries and don't be afraid or apologetic about that. So from your personal life perspective, and for people to know, because you also need to learn to say no from a career perspective. But then when you start looking internally in your organization and how you're trying to measure inclusivity, and I've been at EOH now for 18 months, and I'm going to do a shout out to Melisha, who's our HR executive, who's recently joined us, and she's on the call today, and she's been doing some amazing work, and there has been very little work done to date at EOH, but it's important to measure, because if you don't measure, it doesn't matter, and then you can't see how you're influencing. So some of it, is obviously your stats around gender and race. And then I think the other important area, and often it's a blind spot in companies, is what does the salary pay scale look like? Do you have people where men and women are rewarded differently for jobs that they're performing? And I think you need to uplift that unconscious bias that might exist in an organization, and, you know, put it in front of people's faces so they can actually see that these are the biases in the organizations and this is what we're doing. And then once you can start measuring that, then I think you can start to drive the inclusivity. And then the last point I'll make is, for me, a culture of empowerment and people feeling included and part of the decision making, like, is very critical as well if you want to create an inclusive culture where people feel like their opinion matters. I think gone are the days of having a culture of command and control and where owning information is power. We need to feel comfortable that the more we share, the more inclusive people feel, and the better decision making that will happen. So those are just a few of the pointers from my side.
Okay, that's great. Oh dear, it seems Candace Watson somehow we've lost her. No, she's back. We seem to all be having a little bit of internet challenges this afternoon. So I'm glad you came back, Candace, because I did want to ask you the next question. Can you hear us? Okay, well, we'll give her a few moments to reappear. We had an interesting question from Simone Terblanche, who asked, Candace, Inge, and Megan, are you fulfilled in your careers right now? So let's start with Inge, and just to go around and hear if you are.
That's a wonderful question. I can honestly say that I am, and I can't say that I felt that way over the entire course of my career. And things change and seasons change, and I am a mother of 3. And they are little ones. One is still a baby, and I'm working. My husband actually is studying full time, so it's not a time that I would have thought would be as fulfilling as it has been. But the reason is because I'm able to lead an integrated life where the work is never done, the family time is never done. I have completely broken up with the idea of balance. But I do strive to do the things that bring joy and that are meaningful. And so the work that I do now allows me to have the courageous conversations that I've always yearned to have, where we talk about real things that make a difference for people in their lives. And so being able to engage on those topics as my work has really been something that has led me to feel, wow, I'm finally doing what I always really wanted to do. And of course, my life isn't perfect. And of course, it's mostly complete chaos, but it certainly is fulfilling.
Okay. And Megan, you? How fulfilled are you?
I'm definitely fulfilled. And I think it's not about a paycheck. It's about having a purpose and making a difference in people's lives. And also for me, at EOH, it's the platform that's presented where we can try to influence the narrative and discussion at a business level, and to try and bring back a level of integrity and ethics and caring for our society. So I feel like I get that out of the work I do at EOH. And as Inge says, I don't think people always talk about work-life balance. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. You know, you need to know what fulfills me and what makes me a better person. And me being a better mom, and I said this to you during the week, Georgie, is I think if I was a full-time mom, I wouldn't be a good mom. I think I'm a better mom for working. And you need to acknowledge that. And then don't feel guilty or apologetic about it, because you need to do what makes you the best human being you can be.
Okay, that's great. And in our advanced chat, I said that I completely agreed. I love my children, and I do often have that little feeling of guilt that I'm not spending as much time with them as I could. But at the same time, I need this working time to feel like a complete person. And I also think that I'm showing them the way that a woman can have a successful career and still participate in their lives. Yeah. We had a question that came in the advanced questions that people could ask when they were signing up, from Kanya Nimbula, who asked how to embrace soft power and not allow that to be seen as a weakness, or how to softly use your voice and still be heard. So Inge, have you got anything to say about that? Where and I mean, it's what we've been talking about overall, but again, it's, you know, people talk about letting who you are shine, and it all still seems to be very much about putting yourself out there. So what about those people who are kind of calmer and quieter? How can they use that as a strength?
So, Georgie, I think that's a wonderful question, because we aren't all out there. And it's also important to distinguish between masculine and feminine energy, because let's also be clear that there are many women who do have masculine energy and there are men who have more feminine energy. And so the lines are a bit blurred here as to how we come across and what energy we are drawing on. But if you think about the person that is perhaps more soft-spoken, there is a real opportunity to tap into relational strength there. Very often those people are also good listeners. They might have insight or wisdom. And so if you aren't the person that is able to express yourself loudly in a room to the same extent that others might be, then there's an opportunity there to, and this is something that Megan also touched on earlier, to focus on building strong relationships through your interpersonal skills, potentially your emotional literacy. There is a big world out there that is almost untapped into, in terms of really just investing into being the person who understands the dynamics of relationships within your team, understands people's motivations, and can tap into other strengths or other needs of a team that aren't perhaps as overt as speaking the loudest in the room. And don't underestimate the role of charm. I am happy to acknowledge the fact that that's what I sometimes rely on. When I can't be the loudest, then I will find a way to help or enable people to feel as though they are acknowledged and seen and important in the conversation, because as we all know, people do not remember what you said, they remember how you made them feel. And so you can do that in a soft-spoken way as well. So don't withdraw because you're not matching the same level of energy as other people in the room. Look for other avenues and focus on other things, and don't underestimate the role of charm and emotional literacy.
Okay, cool. We are approaching the end of our time, and I'd just like to hear from each of you. Candice is just having connectivity issues, so she's let us know she's really struggling to reconnect, so I don't think we're going to get her back today. So I'd just like to know from each of you, what has been your kind of biggest message that's emerged from the conversation today that you'd like to get out there? So Megan, what is it that you would like other women to kind of internalize and hold on to from our discussion today?
So for me, it's be authentic in terms of who you are. Show up as yourself. Don't apologize for that. And then also don't be afraid to be vulnerable. And it also requires courage to be vulnerable. So that would be my takeouts from today.
Okay, great. And Inga?
One of the things that for me seems to be a thread in so many of these conversations is the importance of intentionality. So whatever it is that you are engaging with, to do so very clearly, embracing it and not to allow it to happen to you. And also to invest in your relationships, be they relationships in your women's community or be it through the form of networking. There's a wonderful quote by Esther Perel. She's a Belgian psychologist who says that the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your relationships. And I think that that's really important for us as women in how we navigate this time of being authentically ourselves.
Okay, that's great. Well, I'd like to thank both of you, as well as Candice, who's not now here, for your input and your time and, the generosity of your time, because I know it is precious, especially now. So thank you very, very much. To both the CFO and the CHRO community, I'd just like to say that we have some amazing additional webinars coming up in future. So you can go to cfo.co.za/events or chro.co.za/events to find more fantastic webinars that are relevant to your communities. Thank you very much for everyone who attended, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
And good luck, everybody.